Many women are kind of pressured into getting C-sections sometimes, right? Can you break down the business of C-sections for our viewers, please?
Yeah, so the business of C-sections, the reason why in the US and probably in other countries as well, but particularly the US, why we have more C-sections is because there are greater monetary incentives to perform a C-section. The insurance companies reimburse physicians at a higher rate for performing C-sections because they're considered more complex procedures. They're major surgeries. And so there's also the risk aversion. Like doctors tend to be very risk aversive. So if they don't have to be in labor with you for a long time and they can do a C-section, even if they find something relatively minute, and if they can get your agreement, they come in with a smile and like, we really think, this is happening. Before you even get a time, opportunity to push back, they introduce the idea and then it's over with, right? So I think that's why, like the risk aversion, the time factors, the bed, trying to get people out, and of course, the profitability of C-sections in the hospitals make it so that we have more than what is actually necessary.
Earlier too, it made me think. I never heard anyone refer to C-section as a major surgery, but it is though.
It is a major surgery. Yeah. Like you go through layers of tissue and muscle to get to the baby. Then you have to repair that. You have an increased risk of infection. You have an increased risk of blood loss. You have an increased risk of blood clots. Your recovery time is longer. So it definitely is a major surgery. It's not something that anybody should just do happenstance. Not to mention that once you have one C-section, more than likely, like the medical world is going to say like you should have a repeat C-section. A lot of them don't even want to give you the opportunity to have a vaginal birth after a C-section. Not all of them, but that's usually the case.
So how does that work on the body with that constant? That's not a lot of trauma to the body.
To have many C-sections, yeah. Certainly. Most doctors don't recommend that you have more than 3 C-sections. So again, that also limits your ability to reproduce in the way that you might want to reproduce. So the goal is that first child, for it to not be by C-section as much as possible, right? Like sometimes it's necessary, but as much as possible to avoid it. And one good way to avoid a C-section is to not go to the hospital right away when you're in labor. So sometimes people get really anxious when labor starts and they want to go to the hospital and, like, yeah, I'll stay, I'm 2 centimeters. And then you have what they call a cascade of intervention. So you go to the hospital early, you may or may not be in pain. They're like, okay, well, let's just get this. I think that you're in labor. Let's just move it along. And then they introduce the idea of Pitocin, which is synthetic oxytocin, makes your labor contractions much stronger, harder to tolerate. And then you have the epidural. Not to mention that when your contractions are stronger, you're also compromising your baby's ability to deal with that amount of stress. So it's the baby that is often not considered in this process. Like, how is this affecting this human being who's just trying to get here, right? This loads and loads of stress that affect the heart tones. And when you get that drop in heart tones, the next intervention is to do what? Get a C-section. So stay at home as long as possible, labor at home, try the shower at home, rent a birth pool at home, even if you don't plan to push out there, have a doula at home with you. And then once things are really progressing, then that's when you go to the hospital. And have a plan.
All right. And could you give advice to people for finding a good doula and midwife?
Yeah. So with a good doula, you want to, they don't have to be certified, but you want to definitely ask how many births they've attended, the places where they've attended births, where they trained, talk to the people that they've already worked with. Because like I said before, doulas are not regulated. Like anybody could just come up and say, and I've seen this a lot on social media, I call them social media doulas, where they're doulas online, but they don't actually attend births, right?
Isn't that dangerous?
It's not really dangerous because they don't have to do any clinical tasks, but it is like, it's a lack of integrity in it because you can't actually be as supportive as you could be, right? Like a good doula understands hospital procedures. And one of the strongest roles that a doula serves in the hospital setting is advocacy, is being able to understand what it means when a doctor introduces the idea of an intervention and knowing what questions to encourage you to ask, and how that might play out if that intervention happens. Like, should you have your water broken artificially? Some people are like, oh yeah, they had to break my water. Sometimes they don't have to break your water because that's an intervention that can lead to something else, like a C-section.
Can elaborate more on this breaking the water thing when they break your water?
Yeah, breaking the water is something that they do. It's called an artificial rupture of your membranes. So normally when you have contractions, at some point, if it doesn't happen before the contraction starts, the pressure of the contraction just forces the water to break, or the water balloon that the baby is inside of, it opens, right? And the water comes out. Sometimes that doesn't happen and you can be in labor for a while, and then the doctor might, in an effort to make labor progress, suggest that they take a little hook and they hook it inside the bag and allow it to break on its own. And it does oftentimes progress labor, but it comes with other risks and consequences from doing that.
What are some of the risks and consequences?
Infection is one, because now you've exposed the baby to the elements. And so now you're on the clock. So if you weren't on the clock before, now you're on the clock. So you know, you could be in the hospital for 2 days in labor. If your water is broken, there's no signs of infection, let's rock out. But if your water is broken, they're not going to allow you to labor indefinitely, you know, with that open bag because of the risk of infection.
All right. Finding a good midwife.
Yeah, finding a good midwife. My recommendation is, if you're looking for a home birth midwife, that you do get a midwife who is licensed or at least certified. Right? And the difference is a national credential versus a state credential. Licensed midwives, they are credentialed by the state, or they're licensed by the state to practice. Certified midwives or certified professional midwives are nationally credentialed to practice, right? And you want that because that means that they're holding themselves to a standard and that they have been trained according to certain standards to keep you safe. Well, the placenta is the organ that your body develops to nourish your baby in pregnancy. So it ends up being like about the size of my hand, and it implants itself in the uterus, and it's basically everything to the baby. And what you do can affect how that placenta grows. So what you're eating, how you're exercising, even, believe it or not, how you're feeling, it all affects the placenta, and the placenta is what nourishes the baby. The placenta, like even the amniotic fluid, the placenta, all of it has a frequency to it because it's a material object that has energy. It's, you know what I mean? So the frequency changes based on the frequency around you, the energetic frequency, the nutritional frequency, the exercise that you're doing. So if you're active, you're nourishing the placenta, you're making the baby more apt to be able to endure stress in labor. If you eat well, you're nourishing it properly. If you don't do those things, what you can get is something called placental insufficiency, where the placenta decides, I can't do this anymore. Like, I can't even support this pregnancy because I'm either too old, I'm too fatty, I'm too calcified. And so that's when you start to see like the baby have issues with its heart tones. Like a baby's heart tones might get faster, or we might suggest that the baby come out sooner because the placenta has no longer is no longer able to serve its function. So that's like the function of the placenta. I don't know if you're going in the direction of like what to do with the placenta. So a lot of people, once they give birth, people who are in the know, they want to keep the placenta because the placenta is the baby's first home. It signifies that. So in some cultures, they even plant the placenta with a tree that allows the baby to go back, or the family to go back and say, this symbolizes my baby's first home. What they do in the hospital, apart from that whole thing, they tend to detach the baby from the placenta a little bit too early, because when it's still pulsing, the placenta is providing nutrients to the baby. It's also minimizing the chance that the baby would have anemia or other, blood issues. So we want to keep the placenta and the baby attached as long as possible while it's pulsating, while there's still communication between the placenta and the baby.